You sent the memo, but then you didn't wear your pink suit. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where those videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phones. If you haven't been upstairs to see it yet, remember our temporary exhibit of rarely shown flags from the MDAH collection is open in the FedEx Exhibition Hall. And then this Sunday, July 21st, from 3 to 4 p.m., Vicksburg musician Ralph Miller will perform country and folk songs out in the Hall of History as part of our summer music series. Come back for that. And finally, I hope you'll come back next week for History's Lunch, when we'll be joined by Bruce Watson, who will present Freedom Summer from the Ground Up in Mississippi. Today, we're delighted to have Michael Streissguth to present American Culture and the Art of Marty Stuart. Michael Streissguth is professor in the Carroll College of Arts and Sciences at Le Moyne College in Syracuse. He earned his BA in Journalism and History from Indiana University of Pennsylvania and his MA in Communications from Purdue University. Streissguth is the author of 10 books, including Johnny Cash, the Biography, and Outlaw, Waylon, Willie, Chris, and the Renegades of Nashville. He has written and directed 3 documentary films, including the award-winning Nighthawks on the Blue Highway and the Tower Road Bus, and served as a program advisor on Ken Burns' PBS documentary series, Country Music. Streissguth's writing has appeared in the Washington Post magazine, Bluegrass Unlimited, Living Blues, the Journal of Country Music, and other outlets, and he frequently contributes to RollingStone.com. His new book is Highways and Heartaches, How Ricky Skaggs, Marty Stuart, and Children of the New South Saved the Soul of Country Music. Help me welcome Michael Streissguth.
Well, thank you very much, Chris Goodwin, and thank you for bringing me here, and thanks also to the staff of the 2 museums. This is my second time here. The first time was for an exhibit that the Museum of History did featuring the incredible collection of country music memorabilia that Marty Stuart has. I'm thinking about the first time I ever came to Mississippi as a professional writer, and I use that term professional loosely. I think I was being paid $200 to do profiles of some of your musicians and musical business people. I was here to do a profile on Malaco Records. I spent the day with Wolf Stevenson, one of the principals at Malaco. I had a great time. And then it was on up to Yazoo City, where I interviewed the Reverend Arnold Dwight Gatemouth Moore for an article. You may know him, a great rhythm and blues shouter in his day, but then became certainly a well-known minister, a minister of the gospel. And I'll never forget, he had me into his home, and we were in his living room, and I asked him if I could turn on my tape recorder to begin our interview. And he looked at me and he said, "What about my honorarium?" Now I want to tell you, this is almost 30 years ago. I was a newlywed, and I had not planned on paying for the interviews that I had done. And all of a sudden, the lessons from journalism school came back to me. You must not pay for interviews. That is breaking one of the sacred rules of journalism. But I thought, I've come all this way, I've spent all this money on airfare and hotels. What am I going to do? And I took out my wallet and I said, well, I have $20. And he looked at me like a cat. You know, he just kind of looked at me. And then I reached for another $10 bill, and he reached down onto his coffee table, and he slowly opened his Bible, and he said, "Consider it a donation to my ministry." And I felt like at that point, all of the ethical problems just went right out the window. So appreciate being in Mississippi and particularly here at the two museums. I'm wondering if you folks have ever seen this painting. I'm seeing a head shaking right now. Yes, nodding. Anybody? Yes, maybe some people seeing this. And I'm wondering, what do you see in this photo? What do you know about this photo? This photo of this painting, I should say. Anybody? Where have you seen it before? Those of you who are nodding your heads. This is Thomas Hart Benton's painting, The Sources of Country Music, and it sits in hangs in the rotunda at the Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville. So if you've ever been there, perhaps you've seen this painting, and it brings to life so many wonderful aspects of country music. I mean, you see the roots of country music portrayed in this painting by Benton. You'll see in here the Western styles over here on my right. You'll see to the left a sacred music choir singing, a woman playing the dulcimer, a fiddler, and there's a gentleman playing the banjo sitting on a log, and certainly representing that African-American influence in country music, as well as way in the back a gospel choir, and there's the steamboat. Somebody I was talking to recently said that it sort of represented some of the far and distant places that country music has come from. Across the ocean in the British Isles, for example. To me, it just represents the geographical influences, the cultural influences, and on and on. But I think most importantly, it shows that even though it doesn't always act like it, country music has wide and welcoming arms, with so much room for different kinds of influences to enter it. And to me also, this painting represents motion. This is a genre that is in motion. This is a painting that is in motion. People are moving, people are traveling. And so country music is always moving forward, experimenting, trying to understand where it stands, if you will, in the culture. And inspired by images like this, I have, as Chris mentioned, written a few books on country music, on Johnny Cash, Eddie Arnold, the Outlaws he mentioned. And while, of course, my primary concern is to always provide a reliable profile of the individuals, a reliable profile of their music. What really turns me on, what really jazzes me about writing about country music is exploring the culture, the society, the historical events that molded the artists and molded the music. It's my way, I think, of paying homage to some of those influences that are portrayed in the painting that you see now. Just a little trivia, Thomas Hart Benton, who painted this, passed away in 1975, and he was actually waiting in his studio in California for the officials from the Country Music Hall of Fame to visit him and give their final approval to the painting. He passed before that could happen. So if there was anything that the officials didn't like, too bad. They had to deal with what they did have. Perhaps you recognize this native of Western Tennessee. My first biography And don't worry, I'm not going to go through every book I've written, but this is Eddie Arnold, a great countrypolitan influence in the genre of country music. He was often known as a pop country singer later on in the 1960s. Those of you who are younger, I almost guarantee you that your grandparents had albums by Eddie Arnold in their record collection. But in writing about him, I was refer to the photo to my left. I was very, very, very interested in exploring farming culture, rural culture in Western Tennessee. Arnold is pictured here as a boy with his father and his mother. And it was such a delight to go door to door. Arnold left Western Tennessee, Chester County, sometime in the late 1930s, and he almost literally never went back. So it was fascinating to go from door to door and to find people who remembered him and could talk about him, and again, talk about this culture, talk about this world in which he grew up. Later on, wrote about Johnny Cash, and Cash too, an innovator, a great songwriter, an activist in some ways. But what was very interesting to me was to go to Arkansas, northeastern Arkansas, where he grew up, and explore what it was like to grow up in this U.S. government farming collective that was called Dias, the Dias Colony, and Cash would often say that he grew up under socialism. This was during the Great Depression, and it was a government program that lifted many poor farmers in Arkansas out of desperation. And once again, that cultural, that historical story that molded him was just so important to me. By the way, if you're interested in knowing more about Cash's childhood, I would recommend a fairly new book by a Richmond scholar named Colin Woodward, and the book is called Country Boy, and it goes deep into that story of Cash's childhood and how it continued to influence him throughout his career. It's published by University of Arkansas Press. So Chris did a very thorough introduction and mentioned that I had acted as a consultant on Ken Burns' documentary series, Country Music. And at that point, this was just before COVID or so, well, I don't know, just before COVID that this was happening, the production was happening. And one of the great spokespersons in that documentary series ends up being Marty Stuart, if you saw that. But being able to participate with these fellow writers and musicians in helping to advise Burns on the documentary was just so exciting. It was just a lot of fun, and I had not written a book about country music for a good few years at that point, and it really motivated me to go after a subject that I had been wanting to do for a long time, but never had the opportunity to do or the time, and that was a book about Ricky Skaggs and Marty Stuart growing up as children in the country music world. And it was simply that interest in what was it like for kids. They went to work for big names in bluegrass country music at the age of 11, 12, 13. What could that be like in an often seedy world of country music? Here are the two main characters in the book in later years, Ricky Skaggs on the left and Marty Stuart on the right. But as I've already shared with you, it's important for me to understand that bigger cultural picture, societal picture that is around these two artists. I'm assuming these two artists are known to you. If not, I'll tell you briefly that Ricky Skaggs, with the two men with big hair, love it, you know. Ricky Skaggs on my right grew up in eastern Kentucky. He is a child prodigy on multiple instruments and is picked up by the mountain music great Ralph Stanley in the very late 60s and early 70s. And very quickly, Skaggs becomes a driver in bluegrass music. And by the 1980s, he's at the vanguard of a movement in country music called New Traditionalism, which was marrying some of the older elements of country music, the songs, the instruments, with some of the modern embellishments in country music. So he really did a service in bringing some of those essential elements of country music back into popular country music. Marty Stuart, from Philadelphia, Mississippi, born in 1958. He is, too, a master of many acoustic instruments at a very young age. He goes to work in the early 1970s with Lester Flatt, one of the founders of bluegrass music, and tours the nation with him. After Lester dies in 1979, Marty goes to work in Johnny Cash's band. He marries one of Johnny Cash's daughters. He really gets an idea of what the big time is like, and by the 80s and the 90s, he's at the forefront of a movement that he sort of invented called hillbilly rock, and is having a lot of hits with that as well. So they're just a brief biographical sketch of those men. But today I want to talk about journeying into Marty Stuart's world, and into the culture that surrounded him as a child, and discuss perhaps what the impact of that world had on his music as he progressed, and perhaps imply what Marty Stuart's corner of that Benton painting might look like if he did have a place in that painting. When I began working on this book about Marty and Ricky, I had seen the film Mississippi Burning from the 1980s, which was based on the murders of James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman in Neshoba County, Mississippi, in 1964. But considering Marty's middle-class background, he was not born in a shack somewhere like some of the musicians that we talk about. Considering his middle-class background, I thought I'd be going to Philadelphia to discuss things like Philadelphia and the New South and the New South economy, and some of the blues and rhythm and blues stylists who might have influenced him, who lived in that era. The decline of the family farm, whose culture his parents had grown up in. So those were some of the bigger cultural kind of questions, economic questions that I thought I might be discussing. I thought I might be discussing with him school integration, because when Marty was in the 6th grade, Philadelphia, Mississippi began to integrate racially, and he had in the 6th grade a class that was taught by an African-American man by the name of Virgil Griffin, who amazingly had a band. Just fast forward here. Here's Marty as a small guy playing music, and over on the right there's Ricky as a small guy. But Virgil Griffin was his 6th grade teacher, and he had a band called Virgil Griffin and the Rhythm Kings. And they recorded for a label in Greenville, Mississippi. And Marty says, "I've got it made here. This guy's so cool." Again, he said, it was the power of music. Now, I don't know exactly what he meant that by saying it was the power of music. But interestingly, I'll divert for a second to say that Ricky Skaggs also talked to me about the power of music. Like a quintessential Appalachian, his family, his father was a welder, often went into the north to work on big construction projects. The family often went with him, but they often moved back to their home in eastern Kentucky, very quintessentially Appalachian, to not give up the old home because the draw of home was so great. And they, in 1967, moved to Columbus, Ohio. And Ricky talked about being made fun of by the city folk there because of his accent. He was called hillbilly. But he told me that his detractors became his protectors once they learned that he could play music. And he said it was the power of music. So there's the power of music working at a young age. So kids did call him hillbilly, but they didn't after they heard the music. Back to Philadelphia. In my first interview with Stuart, and he's playing here with a bunch of his neighbors who had a band together, and Marty was in all kinds of little bands when he was playing. And you see there that there are two electric guitar players. The other electric guitar, Marty's there at the forefront, of course, and just off to his side is his best friend named Butch Hodgins, and he's his best friend today. But Butch Hodgins told me that the two would always argue whenever they performed Cash's Folsom Prison Blues, who would do that little lead guitar part by Luther Perkins, and normally it got to be Marty who did that. But anyway, for my first interview, again, by this point, COVID had set in, and we were talking on the telephone, and I expected, again, to be talking about his musical influences and how his mother worked in a bank, upending notions about the role of women in the household economy at that point. But almost at the first reference of Philadelphia, he says something like, "It took us a while to recover from the civil rights murders." And I had to pause, and I said, "What do you mean by that?" And he said that my father, it's his father and his mother there, Hilda and John, my father was in the Neshoba County Sheriff's Department until right before the murders. Now, you may know that members of the Sheriff's Department were conspirators in the murders, prominently Cecil Price. And there's Cecil Price there, who was a family friend of the Stewarts. Now, I did not know anything about this. I knew a lot about Marty Stuart up to this point. I had interviewed him many times, but he had never mentioned this. I have read just about anything that you can read about Marty Stuart, and nothing mentioned that his father had been in the Sheriff's Department during this tragic period of history in Philadelphia. But indeed, John Stewart had served shoulder to shoulder with the conspirators in the murders before he left the Sheriff's Department in 1963, 1 year before the murders. He doesn't appear to have been interviewed by the FBI. That I found out through the archives on this very campus here in Jackson. The FBI files and the investigation of those murders are on file here. He doesn't appear to have been interviewed, although Hilda, who you saw a moment ago, was interviewed by the FBI because of her role in the bank. There was, of course, interest in financial transactions that may have happened. There was also, for a short period of time, one of her bosses in the bank was a person of interest, if you will, in the FBI's investigation. But Price is the only person to have gone to prison, and they were on conspiracy charges related to this murder. The only person ever to actually be convicted in the killings was Edgar Ray Killen, a name that may be familiar to you, who was convicted of manslaughter in 2005. This is, of course, very poignant at this very moment in Mississippi as the state observes the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer, a phenomena that had drawn Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman to Philadelphia in the first place. And I have to add that a source that I was highly reliant upon in discussing this part of Stuart's childhood in the book is We Are Not Afraid, the story of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman and the Civil Rights Campaign for Mississippi. That's by Seth Kagan and Philip Dre. But I needn't tell you that what Stuart told me that day on that interview over the telephone launched a year of researching into wondering if John Stuart had ever been a suspect or in any other sense connected to the crime. He was close, obviously, to the suspects in the crime. The family was close to family members of suspects in the crime. Now, again, as I said a moment ago, the answer was a firm no. He had not had anything to do with the murders themselves, but he certainly had been in the department when some staff, some sheriff deputies, including Lawrence Rainey, a name that may be familiar to you if you're familiar with this history, had committed awful atrocities against black residents of Philadelphia. So it's very well documented, again, here at the archives, that in the years leading up to the murders, while Stuart's father was there, that there were a number of very brutal encounters initiated by people in the sheriff's department. Now, another question, of course, became was Stuart's father in the Klan? That I felt was notable. If it was possible that he had he been recruited into the Klan. And of course, you might say, well, so many fathers at this point of white fathers, perhaps in rural Mississippi, may have been members of the Klan. So what? But I wondered, though, if I could really publish this book and talk about this time without knowing if indeed he had been in the Klan. And I had to ask Marty this question. And that was not something I looked forward to. It was not like coming down here and talking to Wolf Stevenson at Malaco Records. All of a sudden, all of the fun that I had envisioned in this project had kind of seeped out, if you will, seeped away. It was a distant memory, because how do you broach that topic with somebody? I certainly had never had to do it. And I should tell you that over decades of writing about Johnny Cash, I had interviewed Marty Stuart many times, and Marty had never been anything but helpful to me. He had made contacts with me. He'd given me interviews. I don't know how many pictures I have of my children with Marty Stuart at backstage after concerts. And I will tell you, years ago, I was working on a documentary about Johnny Cash's show at Folsom Prison in 1968, and we really wanted to interview Cash's drummer, Fluke Holland, who was at the show and performed at the show. But he wouldn't do it unless we paid him an exorbitant amount of money. I needn't tell you, it wasn't Gatemouth Moore's $30 that he wanted. And I mentioned this to Marty Stuart after we had interviewed him for the documentary, and he said, I'll get on the phone and I'll talk to Fluke for you. And next thing you know, we're in Jackson, Tennessee, interviewing Fluke Holland. So that's the that's the goodwill that had been built up between the two of us. So I didn't want to ask this question. But all of a sudden, there were things in Stuart's childhood that maybe I was looking at in a new light. This is the first real professional band that Marty Stuart ever worked for, the Sullivan Family. And the Sullivan Family were a very well-known bluegrass gospel band that toured the Deep South. And when he was very young, in 1972, Stuart and the man who's on my right in this photo, Carl Jackson, the great banjo player, played with Glenn Campbell and others. He was from just up the road from Marty in Philadelphia, Mississippi, went on tour with the Sullivan Family. And they played church revivals and church picnics. It was very, very instrumental in Stuart's development as a musician. Here, they're playing a Wallace rally. Marty does not remember whether or not Wallace was actually at the rally, but nonetheless, very interesting thing. And he told me recently that he was going through his some old guitar cases, and he pulled out a Wallace bumper sticker that had been left over from those days. Now, of course, in country music, I can't think of an artist who didn't campaign for George Wallace in the late 60s and the early 70s. In fact, Tammy Wynette and George Jones virtually turned over their entire career to campaigning for George Wallace. But nonetheless, again, it took on something of a different light, I think, in thinking about this time. Back to Cecil Price, Marty Stuart owns that Stetson that you see Price wearing here. Price gave it to him as a gift, and I thought, well, that was interesting, and certainly perhaps took on a different tone in light of what his father may or may not have been involved in. So I couldn't help but look at his career at this point in the context of what he called the civil rights years. So how to approach him, how to ask this question, what to do. I couldn't ask him by email or telephone. It just seemed too sensitive, too important, really. And so I flew to Nashville in the summer of 2022. COVID was leaving the picture. I was able to speak with him in person, fortunately. And I asked him face to face, was your father a member of the Ku Klux Klan? And his eyes grew wide, and he paused, and he said, "Let me ask Mama." Hilda Stewart is still living. She's still with us, living outside of Nashville, Tennessee, and was a wonderful interviewee for me as well. And indeed, he went to his mother that evening and had a conversation that I'm not sure had ever taken place between the two of them, to listen to Marty tell it. And a few days later, he called me at home, and he said this. The answer is no. He was not in the Klan. But he continued, he said, "I think Daddy had old Southern leanings inside of him that were instilled. But I believe joining the Klan would have crossed a moral line inside of him that he didn't quite have in him to cross. There's no doubt in my mind that he would have been hit upon to be a member of the Klan, but that never ever surfaced. First of all, I don't think he would have been able to keep Hilda if he joined the Klan, because she wouldn't have put up with that for a second." So that question answered, to my relief. Another question arose. As a native, creative voice from Philadelphia, Why hadn't he dealt with the crimes directly in his music? The way that, say, Johnny Cash in his music dealt with, in a very literal sense, dealt with life in rural Arkansas. And Tony Joe White, a favorite musician of mine, in his music has dealt with race relations in his childhood, in his music. And there are many other examples of this. But then I looked again at Marty Stuart's work. This is from his Lester Flatt days in the 1970s. And began thinking about his work in the context of what I knew then about those years. And in the late 70s, he makes his first solo record. It's obscure, it's hard to find it these days, but he had some bluegrass buddies with him. Jesse McReynolds of the Jim and Jesse bluegrass band. Lester Flatt, his boss, was on the record too. But there's also this deeply funky version of the country music classic Love Grown Cold. And it features a popping bass by a man from the black gospel world of Nashville named Earl Peaks. He was brilliant, said Stuart. Now, I doubt that Lester Flatt had ever been in the studio with an African-American musician, but Marty Stuart had brought them together at that very moment. Peaks sadly died of COVID a few years ago. Then, after befriending the Staples Singers, he appeared with the Staples Singers on an album that you may remember. I'm not going as far back as Eddie Arnold anymore. Some of you folks may remember the album Rhythm, Country, and Blues, which put together stars from the rhythm and blues world and the country world to perform great hits. B.B. King was on the album. I think Clarence Carter was on the album. Travis Tritt, people like that. But it was Stewart and the Staples Singers on the song by the band, the old song "The Weight." And after he recorded this with them, he accompanied Pop Staples to the Mississippi legislature, where they both received arts awards. And Pops led the gathered legislators in a version of Will the Circle Be Unbroken, a song which we sing today in large measure because we know it from the Carter family who had borrowed the song, the arrangement, from an African-American influence in their world. And Stuart said to me, that was profound. And I said to myself, these are deep waters. These kind of things are hooked up down in Mississippi that are beyond comprehension. And then I'm going to talk about two albums that, to me, are the core of Stuart's recorded output, one of them being Soul's Chapel from 2004. This is an album, a gospel album, that is firmly based on his gospel music experience as a child in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Not just the white gospel experience, but the black gospel experience. Sounds that often, of course, came together. Of course, it's also deeply rooted in the Staples Singers. If you know the album, the Staples Singers sound. Marty played Pop Staples' guitar on the album, and Mavis Staples appears on the album as well. So, in other words, Stuart was making room in his own music for various influences and styles, where as a child in the 70s, he had been focused strictly on bluegrass music and nothing else. In the 80s, he had been focused on his hillbilly rock sound and nothing else. By this time, he is opening his dance floor to other people. Is he also addressing the terror in Philadelphia, Mississippi in the 1960s? Could be. Could be. In promoting these sounds and collaborating as he has. And then, more recently, he has begun constructing his Congress of Country Music in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Now, this is a facility that features performances. It features memorabilia from his collection, artifacts from his collection, and also is an educational facility as well. So is this yet another bridge that Stuart is building to that era? Again, the answer to that is could be, perhaps so. Then dramatically, and this is the second album that I want to emphasize, dramatically, he records, just after the Souls Chapel album, this album, Badlands. And it deals with the history and also the culture and some of the injustices that the Native people have experienced in the South Dakota region of the United States. It is a searing album. It deals with injustice, it deals with history, it deals with the nation's relationships with the federal government, and I would again highly recommend this album to you. But this is another example of Stuart, perhaps also influenced by the fact that the Choctaw nation is based near Philadelphia, and he grew up in that world as well. But another way in which he is dealing with injustice, dealing with marginalized people, collaborating with marginalized people. There of course, are Native people who are musicians and vocalists on this album. And once again, was this influenced by the incidents, the terror that he had known about growing up in Philadelphia, Mississippi. He would talk about that after the civil rights murders, there was a black cloud that just hung over the city. And indeed, I think the economy of Philadelphia declined after that. And I think I would just theorize, I don't have a hard answer to this, but one of the reasons that people are always asking, how did Marty's parents let him go on the road at 12 years old with Lester Flatt, touring the country in a bus? And could that have been partly informed by the desire to see Marty leave out from under that black cloud that had formed? Of course, the family followed him a few years later after he had established himself in the industry. And so, as I wrote in the book, in reference to Badlands, should the son of Mississippi ever directly consider the darkness of Philadelphia through his art, directly consider the darkness of Philadelphia in the 1960s through his art, then Badlands will credibly stand in until such time might come. And perhaps it will take its place in Thomas Hart Benton's painting in the Hall of Fame. So, thank you, and I'd love to take your questions.
Time for questions. If anyone has one, raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you.
First, I have to say I love your suit. But Mississippi has some very distinctive religious traditions, Christian religious traditions, but very distinctive ones. Could you comment on either Marty Stuart's personal religious background or on those of country musicians in general within the panoply of Christian traditions?
Well, I mean, I can say that Stuart grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and he talks about attending church, attending revivals, and the music that was offered in those settings were highly influential. And he talks about one evening when he went to a church revival in a Southern Baptist church. And the music was so powerful, in not just a spiritual way. I think he was talking really about a physical way, in a sense, that his sister, who was with him, just became wrecked emotionally, and his mother had to take both of them home because the music was so dramatic, if you will, I think. But that's what I know. That's what I know, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Do you know whether or not Marty Stuart had any kind of relationships with black people, whether they're when he was during the time with school or any other social kind of relationship or interaction with black people of his generation?
Yes, I would say, as far as I know, the answer to that is mostly no, as far as his generation. Now, of course, as his school began to integrate, that might have changed, but it wasn't long after that that he went out onto the road and left Philadelphia. But I will say this, that in addition to having the African-American teacher, Virgil Griffin, as his instructor, he also would hang out at a place called the Busy Bee Cafe in downtown Philadelphia. And the Busy Bee Cafe was kind of part juke joint, part restaurant. Philadelphia was strictly segregated, of course, at that time. But a neighbor who lived who had a dry cleaners, one or two storefronts up from the Busy Bee Cafe, would watch him and his sister after school, and they would kind of amble off down the sidewalk and poke their heads into the Busy Bee Cafe, and he would absorb the music. He would have interactions with the people who owned the facility, the joint, and that was very meaningful to him. He continues to talk about that. So I think those two examples represent his interactions. The family also had a helper who came and watched them and cooked for them as well. And I think that would count as another example. He felt like that as many white families who will rightly or wrongly testify to their maid, their African-American maid, as having helped raise them and whom they loved like a mother, that was certainly that's certainly the reaction that Marty has in his memory of the maid who was in their house. Yeah, so that's what I know. Yeah.
Hello. Did you end up ever talking to Stuart's mother about what you asked him, or have a conversation about that, or even other cultural issues such as her being a bank teller and working outside the home?
Yeah, well, so I did talk a little bit more with her about the family's personal relationships with the families of the sheriff's deputies who were charged for conspiracy in these killings, and she did say that there were relationships that were broken. There were people who they could not socialize with anymore, people who used to come to the house and they would sing, just like in Ricky Skaggs' home in Appalachia. People would come to the Stewart's house and sing and play, and a lot of that just came to an end. A lot of relationships ended. Although there were other relationships that continued that the family was close to, such as with the Cecil Price family. The daughters in the two families were friends. Cecil Price went to prison, and the family did try. The Stewart family did try to assist them as they could. So that's what I know about that. Yeah.
I'm interested in how you go about writing, and I'm just wondering the influence you might have on Marty Stuart's life, discursive, where you ask him questions, write about it, and then how he reacts to that, and maybe move his life in different directions just because of the interactions he has with you?
Yeah, you'd have to ask him. Thank you for that question. I think you'd have to ask him that question. I do know that long before I knew him, you could track his music moving into a more democratic version of what music can be, a more inclusive version about what music can be. So I think he was heading in that direction really on his own. I say that with some conviction there. Yeah. So,
Questions?
yes, questions?
Mike, would you maybe talk for just a moment about Marty Stuart's, I guess, I mean, he has to be the premier chronicler and collector of country music history and artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that became so important to him early on? I mean, he certainly had some opportunities that other folks didn't have, but so did other folks like Ricky Skaggs.
Well, I think that from a very young age, Marty did have an appreciation for the older people in his life. He was drawn to older people, and I think appreciated their stories, appreciated their lives. Whenever a country music artist would come through town, if it was George Jones or Lefty Frizzell, I mean, he would be there to talk to them. He'd be there to try to find out what guitar strings they used. He would try to carry their guitar into the gig. There's a bluegrass artist named Little Roy Lewis of the Lewis family who talks in the book about how he just kind of bothered them to death to distraction in trying to find out about them. The first time he ever heard a bluegrass song, he says, was when he went into Frank Tank's fire store in downtown Philadelphia, and he bought a 78 RPM copy of a Bill Monroe song called Wicked Path of Sin. And that was the very first gospel song that Monroe ever recorded, and he bought it and brought it home with him. And I wonder if that was the first sort of old thing in his collection, because it's just grown from there. And I think part of it is rooted in a real desire to tell the story of country music. And I think in some situations, in some cases, you might argue that Marty has actually, in some ways, obscured his own career by talking so much about the history of country music and the contributions of others. So he's, in a sense, sacrificed to do that. And I think that the gift of that, of course, is seen in, for example, his contributions to the Ken Burns documentary film. So.
Right after this, we have a question from Spence Fletcher in the live stream. He asks, what influences inspired you, Mike, your interest in Johnny Cash, Skaggs, Stewart, and the rest?
It was really that understanding that country music and all forms of American roots music could help me understand the world I lived in, could help me understand the history of our country. And what an interesting way to explore history. What more interesting way, as far as I'm concerned, but through music. And that's blues and rhythm and blues and bluegrass and country and right on down the line. I just get so excited about the ways in which I can learn about my country through these artists. Yeah.
My daddy was a fiddle player. He couldn't read music, but he was a really good fiddle player. So I grew up hearing, when we would drive from Vicksburg up to Columbus, hearing, Flatt and Scruggs and all that. And I wasn't impressed as a teenager, I will say. And then, my music was, as a child of the 60s, was the British invasion and, all of that. So we've had a whole lot about Marty Stuart in Mississippi because he's here, and I just always sort of blew him off. He's a strange-looking little fella, and he didn't look anything like my Beatle, George, or, as my music continued. However, I came to the exhibit that was here at MDAH, not to come to the exhibit. I was going to the Green Book. The Green Book was here also. So I was going to see that and hear about, all of that. But I had extra time, so I said, well, I'll just run through here really quickly. And I spent almost the whole amount of time I had in that exhibit that MDAH sponsored. And I was fascinated, and I was ashamed of myself for not, when I saw Marty Stuart on the Ken Burns thing, I kept thinking, why do they keep having him on there? Why everybody else must be dead? And, but after I saw the exhibit and saw Patsy Cline's makeup case and, all of the costumes, I had much, much more respect and went back and researched them a little bit. So these, whether it's History is Lunch or whatever the other programs they have here, they can educate us even when we have moved on from our youthful experiences.
Amen.
And I kind of feel like at some point in the 80s, George and Marty did have the same hairstyle. Any other questions?
Robin?
We have.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
Just one more thing. So Robin Dietrich is in the audience right now, and she edited a wonderful coffee table type of book called The World of Marty Stuart. Laid it out, designed it. You should find that book and peruse it. It is wonderful. It is wonderful. Thanks for coming, Robin. It's in the museum store. There we go. There we go.
We have copies of Michael's book, Highways and Heartaches. We also have a bunch of posters left over from past exhibits in the old Capitol Museum, and when something seems pertinent, I try to put a few out. This is from a 1989 exhibit, Wood Sculptures by Floyd Shulman, and it's a great small poster with a carving of a person with a guitar. If that seems like something you're interested in, they're over there by the coffee. Pick one up. Come back for our events coming up. Don't forget about all the fantastic stuff that's going on. Come back next week for Bruce Watson, who wrote literally the book on Freedom Summer, and he'll be talking about that today. Help me thank Michael Streissguth for this fantastic program.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everybody, for coming.